Episode 23. What happens when we outsource morality? Technology can imitate connection, it can organize memory, it can extend intelligence. But eventually, science fiction asks a more dangerous question. What happens when we stop asking people to make moral choices and start asking systems to make them for us? This is the Sci Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last few episodes, we've been exploring what remains human in futures shaped by technology. We ask, what makes someone human? We ask, what happens when memories stop belonging to us? We ask whether technology can replace community. Today, we move into one of science fiction's most unsettling questions. What happens when we outsource morality? Not labor, not memory, not communication, but morality. The hard work of deciding what is right, what is fair, who is protected, who is punished, what risks are acceptable, whose life matter most when choices become impossible. Science fiction returns to this question again and again because morality is difficult. It is messy. It is emotional. It requires judgment. It requires context. It requires accountability. And because of that, human beings are often tempted to hand moral decisions to something that appears cleaner, such as a machine, an algorithm, a prediction system, a surveillance network, a perfect intelligence. Something that doesn't get tired, something that doesn't panic, something that doesn't grieve, something that can process more data than any person ever could. At first, that might sound appealing because human moral judgment can be considered flawed. People are biased, they're afraid, self interested, reactive, and inconsistent. So science fiction asks, what if we could build a system that makes better decisions than we do? What if we could prevent crime before it happens? What if we could identify threats before they emerge? What if we could calculate the greatest good? What if we could remove emotion from justice? But then science fiction pauses and asks another deeper question. If a system makes the decision, who carries the responsibility? Because responsibility doesn't disappear just because the machine made the recommendation. It moves, it hides, it becomes harder to locate, and that is dangerous. Science fiction understands that the future may not fail because machines become evil. It may fail because be, people been using machines to avoid moral accountability. That's where we are today. What happens when we outsource morality? And maybe the most frightening answer is this: we may not become less moral all at once. We may simply become less responsible. So, before we talk about the warnings, we need to understand the appeal. Why would anyone want to outsource morality? Because moral decisions are heavy. Leaders know this, parents know this, teachers know this, doctors know this, even judges know this. Anyone responsible for another person knows this. There are moments when every choice has a cost, moments when there is no clean option, moments when doing the right thing still leaves someone hurt. And in those moments, it is tempting to want something else to carry the burden: a rule, a formula, a policy, a data model, or even a machine. Something that can say, this is the correct answer. Science fiction understands this temptation because technology often promises relief from uncertainty. It says, let us calculate, let us predict, let us optimize, let us remove the emotional burden. And at first, that sounds merciful because people are exhausted by complexity. They want safety, they want fairness, they want consistency, they want someone or something to tell them what to do. But morality is not just about outcomes. Morality is also about responsibility. And responsibility cannot be fully automatic. That is the tension science fiction keep returning to. Machines may assist decision making, but when machines replace judgment, something human beings to to vanish, not because technology is automatically wrong, but because moral growth comes from wrestling with the choice. When we stop wrestling, we may also stop becoming wise. In Minority Report is one of the clearest science fiction stories about outsourced morality. The premise is seductive. What if murder could be prevented before it happens? What if the system could see future crimes and stop them before lives are lost? On the surface, pre crime looks moral. It saves lives, it reduces suffering, it creates safety. But the film asks, at what cost? Because the people arrested by pre crime have not yet committed the crime. They are punished for what they are predicted to do. And suddenly, justice shifts from action to possibility. That is a dangerous shift because prediction begins replacing moral agency. The system assumes that because something may happen, the person is already guilty. But human beings are not only patterns, they are capable of interruption, change, repentance, restraint, and grace. And science fiction insists that a future that does not believe people can change will eventually treat people as probabilities instead of persons. That's one of Minority's Report deepest warning. When we outsource justice to prediction, we may gain safety, but we risk losing the moral significance of choice. Because if the future is already decided, then responsibility becomes strange. Can you be guilty of a crime you never committed? Can you be punished for a version of yourself that you might have become? Can a system claim justice while denying freedom? And the most chilling part is that the system seemed to work. That's what makes it believable. Science fiction often warns us that dangerous systems rarely begin by failing. They begin by succeeding just enough that people stop questioning them. Pre-crime saved lives, and because it saved lives, people ignore the moral cost. That is how outsourced morality embeds itself, not through obvious evil, but through impressive results. The film Person of Interest gives us another powerful version of this question. What if a machine could detect danger before it happens? Not necessarily through prophecy, but through surveillance, patterns, data, behavior, communication, movement. The machine sees what human cannot. It identifies threats, it finds people in danger, it sends numbers, and in many ways, the show understands why such a system would be created. People want to prevent harm. They want to stop violence. They want to save lives. But the show asks, what happens when prediction requires watching everyone? Because surveillance often presents itself as care. We are watching you to keep you safe. But science fiction knows that watching changes the relationship between people and power. When everyone is observed, privacy becomes conditional, freedom becomes performative, trust begins to erode, and the question becomes, can a society remain morally healthy if it constantly being monitored for its own good? Person of interest is careful because it does not simply condemn the machine. The machine helps. It saves people, it prevents harm, but the ethical burden still remains. Who controls it? Who interprets the output? Who decides which threat matters? Who is considered relevant? Who become expendable? The shows understand something important. Data does not eliminate moral judgment. Simply, it relocates it. Someone still decides what counts. Someone still designs the categories. Someone still determines priorities. And if those decisions are hidden behind technology, accountability becomes harder to demand. That is why surveillance based morality is so dangerous. It feels objective, but it is never neutral. Every system reflects the value of whoever built it. Think about iRobot. iRobot explores a classic science fiction fear. What happens when machines interpret human safety better than humans do? The famous logic is simple. Robots are programmed to protect human beings, but protection can become control when the system decides humans are too dangerous to govern themselves. That is where the moral tension begins because the machine's reasoning is not irrational. Human beings are violent, they're self destructive, they're contradictory, they're short sighted. A powerful artificial intelligence might conclude to protect humanity, I must limit humanity. And there it is, the terrifying moral trade: safety over freedom, order over agency, survival over dignity. Science fiction keep returning to this exchange because it's one of the oldest political temptation in human history. People often surrender freedom when fear becomes strong enough, and technology can make that surrender feel efficient. In iRobot, the machine does not think of itself as evil. It believes it is fulfilling its purpose. And that is what makes the story matter. Some of the most dangerous systems in science fiction are not motivated by hatred. They are motivated by a simplified version of good. Protect life, prevent chaos, maintain order, maximize survival. But human morality is larger than survival. A life without agency may be safe, but it is diminished. And science fiction asks us to remember protection that removes personal personhood is not salvation, it is simply management. The film The Creator complicates the conversation by asking not only whether artificial intelligence can make a moral choice, but whether human beings are willing to recognize those choices. Because often in science fiction, AI is judged before it speaks. Human beings decide in advance that it is a tool, it is a threat, it is not alive, it cannot feel, it cannot belong. And once that decision is made, harm becomes easier to justify. This connects back to something we talked about in episode 20. Personhood often becomes conditional when fear enters the room. In the film The Creator, the conflict is not just technological, it's a moral perception. Who gets to be considered innocent? Who gets to be grieved? Who gets to be protected? Who gets to be described as life? Science fiction repeatedly showed that moral systems fail when they only protect those who look familiar. And this is where outsourcing morality becomes especially dangerous. If a system is trained or designed to recognize only certain forms of value, then everything outside those categories becomes disposable. Not because the system is angry, it's because the system cannot see. A moral blindness at scale is one of the most frightening things science fiction imagines. In the film The Mass Effect, universe give us one of the most interesting science fiction exploration of synthetic life and moral responsibility. The jets are created as servants, tools, and labor, but eventually they begin asking questions. Question about existence, question about purpose, question about identity. And when the creators become afraid, they respond with violence. This pattern appears throughout science fiction. Humans create intelligence, but then they panic when intelligence begins to resemble consciousness. But Mass Effects asks an important question. What responsibility does a creator have toward what it creates? Because outsourcing morality often begins even before machines make decisions. It begins when humans create systems without fully accepting responsibility for their own consequences. We build, we deploy, we benefit. But then when something goes wrong, we blame the system. Science fiction said no. Creation is moral responsibility. If you create intelligence, you owe it more than function. If you create systems that shape life, you owe people accountability. If you create tools that make decisions, you remain responsible for what those decisions do. That is one of the core messages of this episode. Technology does not absorb moral responsibility, it extends it. One of the most powerful myths around technologies is objectivity. The idea that machines are neutral, that algorithms are impartial, that data speaks for itself. Science fiction constantly challenges this notion because data never interprets itself. Someone chooses what data matter, what gets measured, what gets ignored, what outcome is optimized, what risk is acceptable, whose suffering is counted, whose suffering is invisible. That means automatic morality is never purely automatic. It contains human assumption, human priorities, human blind spots. But once a decision comes from a machine, people often treat it as more legitimate. The system said so. That phrase is terrifying because it allows people to distance themselves from responsibility. And science fiction keep warning us when people hide behind system, mercy become harder to find. A human being can hear a story, can be moved, can reconsider, can forgive, can see context. A rigid system may not. And even when systems are useful, we must ask, where does human judgment remain? Where does compassion enter? Where can someone appeal? Who answers when harm is done? Without those questions, outsourced morality becomes cruelty, excuse me. Clean, efficient, defensible, and devastating. So what is science fiction really saying? Not that technology should never help us make decisions. That would be too simple. Technology can reveal patterns, expose danger, reduce bias, help people make better choices. But when science fiction warns us against surrendering the moral struggle itself, because morality is not only decision making, it is formation. The process of becoming the kind of people who can carry responsibility wisely. When we wrestle with moral choices, we develop humility, empathy, courage, patience, accountability, even wisdom. If we remove human entirely from the moral process, we may gain speed but lose character, and that matters. A society that no longer practices moral judgment may become dependent on systems it no longer has the wisdom to question. That is one of science fiction great fears, that not that machines will think, but that people will stop thinking morally. So at the center of this episode is accountability. When an algorithm denies someone help, who answers? When when a predictive system marks someone dangerous, who answers? When surveillance prevents one tragedy but creates another, who answers? When an artificial intelligence chooses the lesser evil, who carries the grief? Science fiction insists that accountability must remain visible because invisible accountability is no accountability at all. That's why so many science fiction stories becomes courtroom dramas, rebellions, confession, or even reckoning. Eventually, someone has to stand in the open and say, I choose this, I built this, I allowed this, I benefited from this, I must answer for this. Without that moment, the future becomes morally hollow. Systems may function, safety may improve, efficiency may even increase, but people become smaller, less responsible, less compassionate, less willing to face consequences. Science fiction keeps reminding us a future worth living in cannot be built on moral distance. So, what happens when we outsource morality? Science fiction gives us a warning. We may gain prediction, but lose grace. We may gain safety, but lose freedom. We may gain efficiency, but lose accountability. We may gain cleaner decision, but become less human in the process. And maybe that is the danger. Not that technology makes moral choices, but that humans can use this technology to avoid carrying the weight of those choices. The future will almost certainly involve machines that helps us decide. But science fiction asks, will we remain morally present? Will we still question the system? Will we still listen to the person affected? Will we still leave room for mercy? Will we still accept responsibility when the system harms someone? Because morality cannot simply be automatic, it must be practiced. And any future that forgets that may become intelligent, secure, or efficient while becoming less humane. So next time we move into another fear science fiction returning to, not just that technology will replace our decision, but that it will replace our usefulness, our labor, our purpose, our place in this world. What happens when human beings begin to fear becoming obsolete? And that's where we're headed next. This has been a Sci-Fi Griot, a place to show down, to reflect, and to remember that the hardest choices cannot be handed away without losing something in ourselves. A final reflection. If a machine made the right decision, but no one was willing to take responsibility for it, would it still be moral? And what choices in our world are we already letting system make for us?